Hello, and welcome to Have You Heard About This Case? My name is Sam, and we're back in the Chicago area this week to discuss the death of Kenneka Jenkins. But before I discuss Kenneka's case, I just want to apologize for being a little late this week. As so much of our country has seen, we've had a lot of severe storms in Chicago recently, and my internet has been struggling through these storms. You might even be able to hear a little bit in the background the intense wind that is going on at the moment. Um, so sorry for being a little bit late, but I had some obstacles that made this take a little bit longer. But let's go ahead and just start talking about Kenneka's case. I really wanted to choose her case and research it because I vividly remember this happening in 2017. She died at the Crown Plaza Hotel in Rosemont, Illinois, and I actually used to work basically across the street from this hotel. And so when this news hit, it was a very eerie feeling because it was almost like it was happening in my backyard. And this case is very interesting, and you'll see why as we go through it if you're not familiar with it. But it was very kind of shocking, and it was all over the news with a whole huge variety of theories of what happened. So I was very interested to kind of dive into it more for this research and putting this episode together. But let's dive right into what happened before I kind of let the conversation get away from me here. But Kenneka was born on May 27th, 1998, and she grew up in the Lawndale neighborhood of Chicago on the west side. And Kenneka was described by friends and family as somebody who always had the ability to make them laugh. And from the way that she was described, it really sounds like she had this great intuition to be able to tell when somebody really needed a laugh or a pick me up. And she very much made it her duty to do so and be that person to bring some light to their day. And this was it's a fantastic quality for somebody to have, but very specifically great quality for her and her chosen career path because she wanted to become a nurse. And at the time of her death, she was actually out celebrating getting a new job at a nursing home, which is just heartbreaking because that's such a phenomenal trait for somebody to have that I think a lot of people strive for. And it's just very sad that in many, many cases we discuss, very sad to see circumstances like that. But late on September 8th, 2007, Kenneka and her friends were thinking that they might head to a late movie. But they changed their mind. They decided to head to a party that was being held at the Crown Plaza Hotel in Rosemont, Illinois. And I just kind of said a moment ago that she was celebrating getting her new job, which was a huge motivation for her wanting to go out and go to this party that night. But the party actually was for her friend's birthday. It was just kind of like a double benefit from that party. But somebody in the group for the party had rented a hotel room, and they invited quite a few people. It sounds like there were about 30 people at a time at this party. And they planned it to have in the hotel so that they can essentially party till the early hours of the next morning. If somebody wanted to, they could rent their own hotel room and just crash there instead of driving home. So around 11:30 p.m., Kenneka and her friends leave her home in Lawndale, and Kenneka had borrowed her mom's car for the night. And as they had initially planned, Kenneka had told her mom that they were going to go to the movies. It was after they had left with the car that they had made the decision to go to this party instead. So her mother was unaware of this. And they decided on the way to this party that they were going to make a couple pit stops. They decided to pick up a Bluetooth speaker, a bottle of Hennessy, some energy drinks, and some weed, on their way out to this party because it was about 20 miles from where Kenneka lived in Lawndale. So it was a little bit of a trip. But it only took about 35 minutes on a normal traffic at this point of day to get there. But because of these pit stops and them making the decision to not go to the movies and go to the party instead, it took them almost 2 hours to actually get themselves to the party. And they arrived around 1:15 a.m. And the party was in room 926, as I said, at the Crown Plaza Hotel. And shortly after arriving at the party, Kenneka sends a quick message to her sister. And this is unfortunately the last communication that Kenneka would have with her family. And we'll talk a little more in detail about the investigation, but there were some videos of Kenneka at the party. And at least one person that night went live on Facebook. And you can kind of see Kenneka in the background a little bit. There's some points where you might be able to hear her off camera. And we'll talk about that more in detail during the investigation portion. But Kenneka herself also would Snapchat at the party. I think it was around 2 a.m. She put up a Snapchat of her in the bathroom. So little after an hour, almost an hour after arriving, she was still active on social media and could be seen in these other videos. And Kenneka's friends were saying that she was having a really good time. She was just chatting with friends, she was drinking, she was dancing. And then around 3 a.m., around 2:30 to 3, the time is reported differently in quite a few different sources. But her and her friends collectively decide that they were going to leave the party. And they leave the hotel room, they begin to walk down the hall towards the elevator. And Kenneka realizes that she left her phone and possibly her keys or her purse or wallet in the hotel room. And at this point of the night, Kenneka is very intoxicated. So her friends say, like, you know what? Just wait here. We'll help you find your stuff. Like, don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. And so they left her just waiting by the elevator just to hang out for a few minutes while they run back, find her stuff so that they can all leave together. And they were in the room for, they say, about 10 to 15 minutes looking for her items. And then they went back to the elevators. But when they got back there, Kenneka was gone. Her friends began to walk around the hotel looking for her. They went down to the lobby to see if she was down there. They walked out to the car thinking maybe she just wanted some fresh air and went and stood by the car. But they couldn't find her anywhere. And by 4 a.m., they were incredibly concerned enough to call Kenneka's mom, Teresa Martin. And they were hoping that somehow Kenneka may have made it home. Like, this was, I believe, the early days or fairly early of Uber and Lyft, but they were thinking, like, maybe somehow, like, we know she doesn't have her phone, but, like, I don't know, maybe she had some money in her pocket. There's taxis in this area. Who knows? But maybe somehow she made it home. And so they called Teresa, just really hoping that she would just say, yeah, she's home, she's in bed. Like, thanks for checking in, she's okay. But unfortunately, Teresa lets them know that she hasn't come home. So not really knowing what to do at this point and having absolutely no idea where Kenneka is, they decided that all the friends were going to take Teresa's car, because remember, Kenneka had borrowed Teresa's car. So she doesn't have a way to get around and get herself to the hotel. So her friends take her car, go back to Lawndale so that they all together with Teresa could come back to the hotel, talk to security, continue to search. And when Teresa gets there and talks to hotel security, she asks if she could check the cameras, if they can at least minimally get a sighting of her to see which direction she could have gone into. But unfortunately, security says at that point that they are unable to do that until there is a police report, until there is some sort of investigation from authorities. So Teresa then heads out to the parking lot, and this is around 7 a.m. at this point, and she calls the police. The police officer that she spoke to advised her that she should probably wait a couple more hours. Kenneka is a 19-year-old young woman, and she was at a hotel party, and it's only 7 a.m. at this point. And my interpretation of what this police officer is basically saying is give her more time to come home because she's probably just sleeping off the partying. And um, the argument that Teresa had raised to this officer's comments was that her and her friends were saying that she was drinking very heavily, and that if she had just gone to sleep it off, why would she leave her phone behind? She clearly had enough wherewithal to notice she didn't have it when they were just leaving the party. So why would she go off moments later without it? That's concerning because of the heavy drinking. And unfortunately, the cop continued to talk her out of reporting her missing at that time, which I understand, and we'll get to a little bit more kind of the breakdown of that sort of idea in just a moment here. But by 1:15 p.m. that afternoon, Kenneka had still not returned home. So Teresa went back to the Rosemont police, and she insisted at this point in filing a missing persons report. And I really want people just to understand this, because I know this is talked a lot about in true crime, but I think it's something that also can't really be talked about enough. Is there's really nothing that prevents the police from filing a missing persons report right away. But it is often discouraged because it isn't uncommon for somebody to return home in their own time. And we hear so many of these stories of loved ones who are discouraged from filing police reports immediately when they know that something isn't right, and they're unfortunately correct. So I think that it's those instances where those stories speak so loudly that it seems like that is such a common occurrence. But there is another side of it. There are people who do appear to be missing that aren't and return quickly, or quickly enough to not warrant a large investigation. But there's the other hand of it, of the family knows who they're talking about and who's missing, and they know their personality. And like I said, I do understand the police's thought here. Just looking at the facts of, this was a party. This is a 19-year-old young woman who is out with friends, partying in a hotel. Um, Admittedly, they're intoxicated. And who's to say that maybe she didn't end up even just meeting somebody and going back to their hotel room? And like, to be honest, it's just not uncommon for a 19-year-old to hook up at a party. And the police don't know whether or not that's within Kenneka's character, but it's an understandable potential conclusion. But then there, as I was saying, there's the other side of it, because you have Kenneka's family saying, like, no, this is not within her normal behavior. And they're the ones who have the ability to properly make that judgment call, but they're still discouraged from filing the report immediately. So if you, hopefully no one is in that situation, even though statistically there will be people. If you so strongly believe it, keep pushing for it, because filing that police report can officially get things started. And as we'll see in this case, it potentially could have had a very big impact. And I think that we should definitely be erring on the side of caution in these sorts of scenarios, But then we get into the whole conversation of funding and resources to do these investigations, and that I'm not even going to get into that whole conversation here, because that's a whole other issue. But I just hate seeing situations where the friends and family know something is wrong, but they're told to wait. And I believe that Teresa must have understood the police's argument, as I do too. Um, but because she does wait, and she gives it a couple more hours and goes back at 1 p.m. to file that police report. But time is very much of the essence in this case. And while there's no blame in any way, shape, or form on Teresa because she was doing what she was told, it unfortunately potentially had an impact here. But now that the police report is filed, the police start going to look in and search in the hotel. And they're starting to search the property as a whole, but unfortunately they really didn't come up with any leads. Then that evening, the hotel contacted the police asking for assistance after a family member of Kenneka's was going around and knocking on guests' doors to see if they had seen Kenneka or potentially had any information. And this is something that was very interesting to me. It sounds like the police had already left the hotel at that point, and this was a handful of hours after the initial police report. I want to say this was around 8 p.m., so about 7 hours after the police report was actually filed. But they would have been at the hotel, conducted a search, and left by 8 p.m., and then were called back due to this family member disrupting guests. And again, I understand why he's going and knocking on the doors and asking questions, because a loved one is missing and this was the last place they were seen. I also understand the hotel calling to get assistance because this is disruptive to people who potentially have zero involvement or have zero idea of what is even happening at the hotel, and that there might be somebody missing. But it's interesting to me that the police left and then were called back for this. And that's really even more so because it was this point when they returned to the hotel that they began to review the surveillance footage. And I don't know if it took a while for that footage to be pulled and provided to the police, and it just, that timing worked out. When they came back, it was available for them to begin to review. Which is, I will say, that is possible. It's very possible that that footage wasn't available by hotel staff on site, and that they had to kind of go up the chain of command and request that footage from corporate. But I feel like 7 hours is a long time for that. Um, and the reason I'm saying that kind of confidently, at least in my own opinion, confidently, because I've had kind of similar situations where I've had to request security footage from corporate that I didn't have the ability to pull myself. And this was kind of around the same time. I think this was probably 2018 that this happened to me, but I worked in a store and somebody snuck into the back room and stole my purse. And I had to file a police report, kind of just did everything, both like incident report with the company, police report with the local authorities. And I had to request the camera footage from the back room from corporate so that I can provide it for the police. And that took about 2 hours for me to get that. And it was this same sort of scenario that I'm thinking is a good possibility that the Crown Plaza Hotel had, where they can see the live feed of the cameras, but they're unable to manually rewind or pull footage themselves, which was the situation that I had in the retail store I worked at. So I can understand there being a delay, but a 7-hour delay seems quite extensive in my opinion. And then just the timing of they happened to come back for this other incident they were called for, and oh, by the way, we have this for you now. Um, it seems like there were some delays here that didn't necessarily need to be, but I also very much could be wrong in that situation. I don't know what the specific timing details, um, but just kind of the thoughts in my own head. But as they begin to review the footage, they weren't really finding much. And I imagine that there's quite a bit of footage to be reviewing here because it's a large hotel and there's many different cameras across this hotel, and they don't really know where Kenneka may have gone or really what happened after she was left sitting next to the elevator on the ninth floor. And the police aren't really getting too far, and they basically tell the hotel, like, continue reviewing the footage. We'll do it on our end as well. And we'll kind of touch base tomorrow and see where we're at. And that night, police leave, and the overnight staff for the hotel continue to go through the footage and continue to basically walk the hotel and continue searching it. And just after midnight, a member of the hotel staff was walking around one of the kitchens and discovered in one of the freezers that Kenneka was actually lying on her side, face down, inside of the walk-in freezer. And they immediately called police and paramedics. And when they arrived, there were no signs of life. And Kenneka was pronounced dead at 12:48 a.m. on September 10th, 2017. And at this point, it appeared that Kenneka had died of hypothermia, but the autopsy would need to confirm that. But the only injury that Kenneka had was a small cut, more like a scrape to her foot, and a bruise on her leg. So very minor, very superficial, and it is believed that they were not any sort of defensive wounds. But there were no other outward signs of injury, which is why it was believed that there's a good possibility her cause of death would be hypothermia, which is what would be later confirmed by the autopsy. And the temperature of the freezer wasn't immediately taken by investigators, but they would end up taking the temperature about 2 hours after the discovery of her body. And at this point, 2 hours later, the temperature was 34 degrees, but the door had been open that whole time during that investigation and finding her. And so that temperature definitely had increased over that 2-hour time period. And I'm assuming the freezer was probably still running, which is why it was able to at least maintain 34 degrees. But it would be determined that this freezer had the ability to get down to 8 degrees. So there's a big range of temperatures that it could have been set at within there that still would have caused hypothermia if she had been in there for an extended period of time. And it had been nearly 24 hours since Kenneka had been seen by her friends. And that's a pretty large window of time to have been in that freezer. And they're not entirely sure what time she could have gotten into the freezer. And there's a lot of questions with this because we don't know how she got herself down there. We don't know if she had help getting down there, if she was coerced getting down there, because the area that she was found in as well is a conference center kitchen within the hotel. And this conference center was currently closed and should not have been accessible by other guests. And this was also the middle of the night. There was hotel staff there. Did anyone see her? There were other guests around. This was a very large hotel. It's right near the airport, and there's people coming in and out all times of the day. Were any guests there seeing her? really just what happened between leaving her on the ninth floor for 10 to 15 minutes to her being found 24 hours later dead in a freezer. Um, and no one really had any answers for what happened in between there. So now that her body had been found by investigators, they really needed to change gears. And in reality, they needed to kick their investigation into gear. And they had to come up with some answers because up until now, their investigation really didn't seem that thorough, minimally to the public. But I think we'll see here that there's definitely some missed opportunities, at least in my opinion, and what seems to be the fairly general consensus from a lot of arguments I've seen online in this case. And I remember this happening. I remember I heard this really once it hit the news, probably within a few hours of her being found. And nearly immediately, Kenneka's friends and family were very vocal about their frustrations with the investigation up until this point. And I get it. At this point, they needed an autopsy to really learn more information, but everyone's thought in the back of their head was how long could Kenneka have been in the freezer before hypothermia set in and she died? When her mom asked to review the surveillance footage, which I'll get to in a moment because we do actually have surveillance footage from the hotel that I'll discuss. But when she had initially asked for that and was told that the police needed to request that from the hotel and that they wouldn't give it to just her. And then when she then followed up with the police and wanted to file the missing persons report and was told that she should wait a couple more hours, could that have changed the outcome of this? Could that have potentially made a difference and potentially saved Kenneka's life? And I don't think we really have an answer to that. It is incredibly difficult to tell because there are so many different factors when it comes to hypothermia. And the autopsy would, as I said, confirm that as the cause of death. And I asked my coroner friend on her thoughts on this, and she struggled to really give me any information either because it is something that is so dependent on such a large variety of things that it can take a vastly different amount of time for hypothermia to set in for different people. And I think that that still leaves some credence to like it's possible, but like we can't say yes confidently 100%. But is the possibility there? Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately it is. And I think that is something that makes this case so incredibly heartbreaking is because we won't have that answer, but the fact that it's not an outright no is just it's so heartbreaking and tragic. And I think that's a big reason why this case really gained as much traction as it did, which again we'll get into a little bit of that, but there was a lot of traction in this case. There was a lot of discussion, a lot of different theories going around online. Um, but let's get back to those camera footage. I mentioned it a couple times that there is the surveillance footage from the hotel, and it would be finally all reviewed, and Kenneka would be spotted multiple times starting around 3:30 a.m., which coincides with the friends who were leaving the party around 2, left for 10 to 15 minutes to try to find her items back in the room. And then 15 to 20 minutes later, she's spotted on cameras in the hotel. And she's just walking down the hallway and she's very, very clearly intoxicated. And there's been quite a bit of this footage that has been released, and it is linked in my show notes. But there's a handful of camera angles, and it's clear throughout that she is very intoxicated and she's stumbling around. She's basically holding on to the wall to prevent her from completely falling to the ground. At one point, she's seen running into a railing, a stairwell railing, and really barely catching her fall before she just loses control to the ground. She holds on to that stairwell railing very tightly, and you could tell that she's just trying to keep her balance, which is a real struggle for her in the current state that she was in. And there are a couple angles that show her going into that conference center kitchen. The cameras don't point directly at the freezer that she was found in, but it did show her walking through this kitchen area. And because it doesn't point to the freezer, you don't actually see the circumstances of her going into it. And with this area being completely closed off, she's the only person walking through this portion of the hotel. And these cameras that are catching her are motion activated. So a lot of the footage that we're seeing, she's already in frame when the cameras turn on, because this area was closed. So they weren't consistently on there. She was really the only thing triggering a lot of these cameras in this specific portion of the building. But it was observed that she was walking around for nearly an hour after she separated from her friends. And because she was in this portion of the building, that's why her friends probably were unable to find her, even though at the time they were searching the hotel, which is just another thing that very much breaks my heart in this case. But when the footage was released, the police really used this to defend their findings that Kenneka's death was accidental. They believed that she went into the freezer on her own while she was highly intoxicated, and due to her level of intoxication, she either couldn't figure out how to exit the freezer, she was too intoxicated to physically open the handle and exit the freezer, or she was physically unable to do it for other reasons, which we'll get into a couple of those theories in just a moment here. But the autopsy findings supported death due to hypothermia, but they also noted that factors contributing to her death was the alcohol and topiramate, being those two being contributing factors to her death. And topiramate is a medication that is commonly used for epilepsy and migraines and was not prescribed to Kenneka. And what's interesting about this is this is not a drug that is typically used as like a party drug. So it's not entirely sure why Kenneka may have taken this. Honestly, my belief is that she didn't know it wasn't a party drug, or whoever gave it to her didn't know, or was just trying to, you know, make some money selling some pills. Which as a whole is just very sad that that is a possibility. But I believe that there's a good possibility she took this medication of her own accord, thinking it might have an effect and add to her experience at the party. But we don't really know that. And I kind of, the conversation very much ends there, I think, for the most part. Just because we don't really know a whole lot about it. We don't know where it came from, and it wouldn't have had those effects that would have really made a difference for her at the party. But in combination with the alcohol, it was specifically called out as something that impacted her death. And while all this evidence does support the police's theory that Kenneka's death was an incredibly unfortunate accident, Teresa has publicly discussed that the footage doesn't actually prove anything to her. And it doesn't show her going into that freezer on her own. She believes that Kenneka wouldn't have done that. And even if she was highly intoxicated, she believes that somebody likely forced her into the freezer because she would have understood, even in that state, that the freezer isn't going to lead her anywhere and that it has the potential to be difficult to get out of. This freezer did have an interior latch that would have opened up and allowed anyone who was inside to get out, but it doesn't appear that Kenneka had used that. I'm not even sure if there were lights that would have been on in this freezer. It may have been very dark. And then combined with her intoxicated state, whether it was herself who put herself in that freezer or if it was somebody else, it could have been very difficult for her to get out. But Teresa does believe that there was somebody who intentionally put her into that freezer. And once that became kind of publicly discussed, the internet ran wild with it. Social media posts at the party were dissected, and there was this one Facebook Live video that was recorded that night where people just dissected this video frame by frame, and it was viewed millions of times within just a few days of Kenneka's death. And people wanted to find the answers in this video so badly that they went through every single portion of it. And some of the observations were valid. So at one point, the Facebook Live video is believed that Kenneka can be heard in the background saying loudly that she wasn't drunk, very much in a way that would imply that she very much was drunk, which is something that we do know would at least be an outcome of the evening, regardless of what time this was. She potentially wasn't very drunk at the time, but we know she would get there. And a lot of people say that the way it was said just implies that, yes, indeed, she was drunk at that point. And so that there are definitely some things within that video that can be very helpful to the investigation in the timeline. But there are other theories that came out from this video. There's a short portion where the camera is facing a woman who is wearing reflective sunglasses, and people believe that they see Kenneka in the reflection and that they're trying to see like what state she might have been in this little reflection in the sunglasses, see if she was potentially with somebody or if they could potentially be taking advantage of her. But I don't think the visual was good enough to determine any of that or even have the confidence that it was Kenneka being seen in the reflection, even though many people believe that it was. But there were theories like that where it's like they're trying to find something conclusive out of something that just can't be fully determined. And some of these theories got very intense. They looking deep into that video, it was the last known visual of her. I get it. I get why people want to. And beyond the hotel footage, that has the most potential to give us the insights and answers to what happened to Kenneka. But some of these theories are wild. At one point, the police received a tip, and the tipster said that they were at the party and that they had heard that Kenneka had been killed for $200 so that they could harvest her organs. And people were saying that no, that was actually the hotel staff and that they had put her in the cooler for essentially the same reason, to harvest her organs. And there were people breaking down the hotel surveillance footage saying that they believed that there was somebody else who was with her, who was able to keep themselves out of the camera angles and basically knew where all the cameras were in the hotel and was able to stay out. And that the hotel was purposely not releasing all of the footage, but only the couple clips with her in it so that they could keep this person's identity a secret. And I believe that there are a few points in the footage where people were really trying to say that, like, "Oh, look, she's so clearly looking off at somebody in this direction or talking to somebody off camera over here," um, or that there's actual footage of her being put into this freezer, and again, the hotel's protecting whoever would be doing this, by not releasing the footage and keeping it to themselves. Um, but the obviously these are all just rumors. There's no evidence to any of this. But this was all over the internet, and I remember when this was all happening, I felt like if you were to look up this case, you would see all of those sorts of conversations before you saw the actual details and confirmed facts of the case, which made it just kind of even more widespread with these theories. And the police have addressed many of these theories, and they've discussed in their investigation into these theories, and they did a lot of follow-ups that they've openly discussed with nothing coming from it. And I think at the time, this part of their investigation wasn't being widely talked about because they stood by their first theory of saying that we think this was a tragic accident. The evidence that we have supports that she died of hypothermia, that there were no defensive wounds, and the camera footage showing her alone walking through the hotel, clearly intoxicated, supports that she could have ended up in there on her own and unfortunately died due to the cold of the freezer and the alcohol and medication in her system without any additional factors or outside foul play. But they did publicly discuss the handle on the inside in their investigation of that. That is something I vividly remember in the news, and how they were very clear about the fact that they had tested the handle. It did open without any issues, um, but that given her current state, that it could have been very difficult for her to have opened it. She may not have even known that there was an interior handle. And in a state of hypothermia, um, especially given the fact that she was also highly intoxicated, you get very tired, and you also start to get warm, and your body's just reacting to it. It's essentially a kind of like a chemical reaction that your brain is going through. And so it's very possible that Kanika went through a moment of attempting to get out, but made the decision to just kind of curl up on her own, um, where she eventually kind of fell asleep and then succumbed to the hypothermia. Obviously, we don't know that as a fact, but it's a possibility. But I think one of the bigger concerns here, because obviously they wanted to investigate the handle of the door because they wanted to determine if there was this clear liability on the hotel. If she got in there, she couldn't get out. But because the handle was functioning properly, obviously that issue becomes more complicated. But what I think was is more of the conversation is just the fact that she was able to get down there to begin with, and that the freezer wasn't secured from the outside, preventing anyone from just getting into it on their own, because the freezer wasn't being used. There was no food in the freezer. There was it was literally just an empty room that was cold. Um, and so why was that not secured to prevent that freezer from even being opened up? Because it wasn't in use. And that was the argument that Teresa actually brought forward in a lawsuit that she filed in December of 2018 against the Crown Plaza Hotel, their security company, and the restaurant within the hotel. She was basically saying that they were all negligent for not securing that portion of the hotel, because it is also determined that that portion of the hotel was technically under construction, which was one reason why it was off limits to guests. And From my understanding, there wasn't clear signage. Obviously, Kanika could still get through the doors, and it wasn't locked. And in addition to not having any signage, she was able just to walk through the door and get herself into there without anyone knowing. But then going forward with that, just being able to then access the freezer. So you first have the stage of getting to that area, then getting into the freezer, and then the lawsuit continued with the security company because she asked to do a search and she asked for the footage when there still could have been the time to save Kanika. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we're not incredibly confident that that would have indeed saved her life, but it is a very good possibility that it could have. Um, so this lawsuit was actually settled in December of 2013, 5 years later, and Teresa settled with the hotel for $10 million. And really, this isn't compensation for her losing her daughter, and especially when you think about it as potentially being preventable, both before she had entered the freezer and potentially after she had entered. Um, $10 million is a whole lot of money, but that there's no compensation for that. And knowing that, which is just heartbreaking. But overall, this case is very divisive for a lot of people, and I very much understand why. There are a lot of people who agree with Teresa and that Kanika was murdered. And there's a lot of people who believe that there are odd circumstances to this case and kind of are on the fence. And there's this question of why would Kanika walk away from her friends when they just ran to go get her phone? And there are people who believe that this was just a tragic accident and that she went to the freezer on her own and due to her level of intoxication was unable to open that door, which I'd say is more of what I personally believe. And as I was saying, but I think that there's a good possibility there was not a light on in the freezer, which I can only imagine would have made it so much more difficult for her to find the latch. And you just think about, and it's such a sad and terrifying thing to think about. But I she's in there. It's potentially 8 degrees, and she's intoxicated, attempting to feel around for a handle, but her sense of touch is already impaired due to the intoxication. And now she's touching cold metal because the interior of those freezers are metal because they're insulated. And that sense of touch already being impaired, then touching the cold metal is also going to basically have a numbing effect on her fingers and can make it incredibly difficult for her to operate a handle, let alone find it. And I do believe that she ended up there just on accident, and she didn't have the intention of going in there, but it is unfortunately what happened. But I do very much agree that the hotel is in all likelihood liable for this, and then the settlement shows that there's definitely agreement in that she should not have had the ability to get to that section of the hotel, and most specifically she should not have had the ability to get inside of that freezer. And one thing that's frustrating to me, that I've seen online, is some people have made the comment of like, she was an adult, she drank, she did all of that, she ended up in the freezer. Like, why is that necessarily the hotel's fault? Because she was an adult and made her own choices that led there that night. And my argument to that is, imagine this was a child. What if a kid kind of ran off from their parents, ended up in this section of the hotel, and got themselves into that freezer? That it's such an terrible circumstance and scenario, but it would probably have the same outcome. And it's terrifying and horrible, but why are those two situations so incredibly different? There's still a liability by the hotel to keep that area protected and prevent anything from that happening, which is why things like the locks and securing the area are so important. And what if the police had begun their search at 7 a.m. just a couple hours after she was last seen? Could that have made a difference? I said we don't know because we really don't, but um, it really sucks to wonder and not have an answer to that. But I'm very curious to hear what you all think. I understand the belief in the foul play idea because there's no visual evidence that actually shows her going into the freezer. There's just very odd circumstances with how she ended up down there. Um, but I also think that the lack of evidence that shows that there was potentially somebody else involved kind of speaks to the fact that the likelihood is that there isn't. But I would be very interested to hear your thoughts, hear what you guys believe, especially if you do believe it was foul play. I would be very interested to hear why. Um, so I would very much appreciate if you guys just leave a message or a comment, give me your thoughts. But that is all I have for you today. I hope that you all enjoyed this episode. And thank you for listening to Have You Heard About This Case? If you liked this episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and you follow our show on Spotify and can leave us a review there. You can find us on YouTube at Have You Heard About This Case, on Instagram at Have You Heard About This Case Pod, on TikTok at HYHATC, or you can email me at haveyouheardaboutThisCase@gmail.com. Thanks, and we'll talk to you later.